Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into one of the most haunting ideas that physics has ever brushed against, the suggestion that your consciousness might never truly end. The thought arises from a peculiar interpretation of quantum mechanics called the many worlds interpretation, and from a provocative thought experiment often called quantum suicide, which leads to the unsettling notion of quantum immortality. But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a joy to see all the places we gather from, each in our own little slice of time. Now, feel free to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and let's gently begin our journey into the strange possibility of consciousness wandering forever. And if your mind begins to drift, that's perfectly fine. Let it wander. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story. At first, the phrase quantum immortality sounds like the sort of idea you might expect to find in a science fiction paperback tucked between tales of spacefarers and parallel universes. But it has its roots in a very real, very serious corner of modern physics, the attempt to understand what actually happens when a quantum system is measured, when a particle is in a superposition, which simply means it holds several possible states at once, and we look at it, we only ever see one outcome. Why is that? Does the wave of possibilities collapse, choosing just one? Or do all the possibilities continue to exist, each in its own branch of reality? Back in the 1950s, a young graduate student named Hugh Everett proposed the second option. He suggested that the wave function, the mathematical description of a quantum system, never collapses. Instead, it evolves smoothly according to a simple rule called the Schrödinger equation. But when an observer interacts with the system, the observer becomes entangled with it, bound into its possibilities. The result is that the universe itself seems to split, with each outcome continuing in its own track. In one branch, the cat in the famous thought experiment is alive. In another, it is dead. In both, the story goes on. This idea came to be known as the many worlds interpretation. To most physicists at the time, it sounded outrageous. Yet over the decades it has gained a certain respect, especially because it doesn't require us to add any mysterious collapse mechanism to quantum theory. All that happens is that the single river of reality forks, and forks again, endlessly. Now imagine yourself not as a physicist scribbling equations, but simply as a person. You flip a coin, it lands heads, but in another branch of the universe it lands tails. Both happen. Both outcomes are real, though you only experience one. It feels like a trick of mirrors, like stepping into a dressing room lined with reflections, each showing a version of you, turning at a slightly different angle. Only one reflection follows you out the door, yet the others remain, frozen in their own silent halls. So here is the haunting question that tonight's journey will revolve around. If reality truly does branch, then what happens when you face situations where one branch contains your survival and another does not? From your first-person perspective, do you only ever continue in the branches where you live? Does death simply vanish from experience, leaving only the strange illusion of survival without end? This is the essence of what people call quantum immortality. It suggests that, subjectively, you might never encounter your own absence. You might always find yourself in the branches where you somehow escape, no matter how improbable. At first, it sounds almost reassuring, like an ultimate safety net woven into the fabric of physics. But as we'll see, it may be less comforting than it appears. Because survival in this frame doesn't necessarily mean flourishing. It could mean lingering in fragile, improbable, even painful ways, like a candle that refuses to go out, sputtering in drafts long after its wax is burned away. Before we dive deeper, it's important to make something very clear. Quantum immortality is not a scientific fact. It is a speculative extension of a particular interpretation of quantum mechanics. Physicists themselves disagree sharply about whether it even makes sense, and many point out that it cannot be tested in any meaningful way. Moreover, the thought experiment often called quantum suicide, the supposed way to test many worlds, is not a real experiment. It is dangerous, unethical, and, as most philosophers now agree, scientifically useless. Tonight we're exploring these ideas only as ideas, not as recommendations, not as truths, but as a way to reflect on what consciousness, probability, and identity might mean. And yet, even as a story, the notion of quantum immortality unsettles. It calls into question what it means for you to be you. If every possibility unfolds, what anchors your sense of continuity? If survival branches always exist, what does probability really mean? And if you cannot witness your own end, does that mean your subjective experience stretches endlessly, even if your body does not? These are not puzzles with easy answers. They are rather places where the border between science and philosophy grows thin, where physics brushes against questions of meaning and mortality. As we go forward, we will take this journey slowly. We will trace the origins of many worlds, the logic of quantum suicide, the alluring but dangerous promise of immortality, and the deep scientific and philosophical objections that push back against it. Along the way, we will use everyday examples, mirrors, coin flips, the sound of rain, to make sure the ideas feel soft and clear, not sharp or mathematical, and we will always return, at the end, to what it means for us as humans, living finite lives, to wonder about the possibility of never-ending awareness. So, take a breath, settle in. Let the thought unfold gently, like mist across a quiet field. We begin with Hugh Everett's daring idea, the many worlds interpretation, and the strange logic that has carried some thinkers to the edge of immortality itself. If you could step back into the corridors of Princeton University in the mid-1950s, you would find a young physics student named Hugh Everett pacing, notebook in hand, carrying a thought so bold that even his professors scarcely knew what to make of it. The world of quantum mechanics already had its puzzles. In class, Everett would have been taught the standard way of looking at quantum experiments, that the delicate wave of probability somehow collapsed the instant an observer measured it. The equations would say one thing, yet when you looked, you only saw one outcome. This was the Copenhagen interpretation, championed by Niels Bohr and others. It was practical, but it left a mystery unresolved. What exactly made the wave collapse? Did the act of a human mind peering at the system cause the universe to choose? Did the measuring device itself do it? Or was collapse simply an extra law added to the equations, a rule for when possibilities must vanish into a single reality? Everett was unsatisfied with that patchwork. The equations of quantum mechanics, the Schrödinger equation that smoothly describes how a wave of possibilities evolves, never mentioned collapse. They simply said, the wave keeps evolving, always. For Everett, the simplest answer was to take the math literally. There is no collapse. The wave never stops spreading. Instead, when a measurement happens, the observer becomes entangled with the system. Observer and particle are now part of the same equation. One version of the observer records outcome A, another version records outcome B. Both are real, and both continue forward. Think of it like a great river. If you look downstream, you see it split into two channels. Each channel flows on as if it were the only river. Everett's claim was that the universe itself behaves this way, endlessly branching with every quantum event. What we experience as a single history is simply one winding channel among countless others. At first glance, this sounds like science fiction. Yet Everett was not writing a story. He was offering a rigorous interpretation of the same equations everyone already accepted. His argument was essentially, stop adding collapses that the equations never ask for. Trust the math. If it says the wave spreads, let it spread. If it says both outcomes happen, then both outcomes happen. The price you pay is that reality is far vaster than our daily experience admits. Everett published his work in 1957, calling it the relative state formulation of quantum mechanics. Few people paid attention. Bohr, the towering figure of quantum theory, dismissed it. Even Everett's advisor tried to steer him away from pursuing it further. Frustrated, Everett left academia for government work soon after. But his idea lingered, like an ember refusing to die out. Over time, others began to see its appeal. It solved the so-called measurement problem without adding hidden rules. It explained why the equations worked so well in practice. And with the rise of new concepts like decoherence, the way the environment itself suppresses interference and makes branches look classical, Everett's vision began to sound less like wild speculation and more like a consistent worldview. Decoherence, explained gently, is like footprints in wet sand. When you first step down, the sand is soft and patterns might blur. But as the tide pulls away and the air dries, the footprint hardens. In the same way, quantum systems interacting with countless particles of the environment quickly settle into stable pointer states, records that no longer blur together. One outcome looks solid, and the others drift off into invisible channels, still real but no longer able to interfere. The many worlds interpretation does not require us to imagine new laws of physics. It simply extends the existing ones, allowing them to run without interruption. And if that is true, then every time a quantum event has multiple possibilities, reality as a whole does not choose just one. It allows all of them. Each outcome becomes its own path, with its own observer continuing forward. This brings us back to you. Because if Everett is right, then each time you make a choice, or even each time a particle inside your neurons has a chance of firing one way or another, you may be branching. In one world you sip tea, in another you leave the cup untouched. In one world you turn left on your walk home, in another you go right. Each world feels whole, continuous, and real. But behind the scenes, they're all part of a larger tapestry, one universal wave function unfolding. It is important to pause here and notice how strange, and yet how oddly natural this vision is. On the one hand, it feels alien. Infinite worlds splitting, infinite copies of yourself wandering paths you will never see. On the other hand, it requires no strange collapses, no special role for consciousness, no exceptions to the equations. It is physics taken at face value. Everyday life gives us metaphors, though they fall short. Imagine walking into a hallway lined with countless mirrors. Each reflection turns slightly differently as you move, showing futures that branch away from your steps. You only walk down one corridor, but the others gleam silently as though waiting. In Everett's universe, those reflections are not illusions. They are as real as the one you inhabit. Everett himself could not have predicted how far his idea would travel. Today, the many worlds interpretation is debated in classrooms, research papers, and late-night conversations alike. Some physicists embrace it as the cleanest way to read quantum theory. Others recoil, pointing out that it multiplies realities beyond any hope of direct verification. Still others shrug, using whichever interpretation helps them calculate but leaving the deeper question unsettled. Yet for our purposes tonight, we take it simply as a stage. If the universe does branch, if all outcomes occur, then what does that mean for you, the person listening here, wondering about your own consciousness? Could it mean that, when faced with life and death situations, there will always be at least one branch in which you live? And if so, would you ever truly experience your own end? These are the haunting questions that lead from Everett's quiet notebook to the bold, troubling idea of quantum immortality. We will approach them carefully, slowly, like someone opening a door into a room where the light is dim and every corner holds a mystery. For now, hold the picture of Everett's branching river in your mind, a river that never collapses, only divides. In the next session, we'll explore how this branching raises puzzles about probability itself, and why the simple act of flipping a coin can shake our understanding of survival. Imagine standing in a quiet forest, where two paths diverge before you. One winds toward a sunlit clearing, the other bends into deeper shade. In ordinary life, you would choose one. Your shoes would press into the soil of a single trail, and the other would remain forever untaken. But in the quantum world, the story is stranger. The particle does not simply choose, it spreads itself like mist, following both paths at once. Physicists call this a superposition. It's not that the particle is sometimes here and sometimes there, like a coin flipping in mid-air. Instead, before you look, it truly exists in a blend of possibilities, both paths overlapped. You can think of it as a chord in music, several notes sounding together, not yet resolved into the single line you expect. Now, when an observation is made, when the particle interacts with something larger, like a measuring device or even a wandering photon from the environment, the harmony changes. In the traditional view, one note is chosen and the rest fall silent. But in Everett's many worlds vision, all the notes continue. Each one carries on into its own unfolding melody, its own world. This branching is not like a physical explosion of copies scattered around the room. It is quieter, subtler. The universal wave, the grand description of everything, continues to evolve smoothly. But from within, each outcome feels like the only one. If you flip a coin, you see it land heads. Somewhere else in the branching wave, another you sees it land tails. Neither feels the splitting. Both feel reality settle firmly, as if no branching occurred at all. It is natural to ask, why don't we notice? If the world is splitting all the time, why don't we see the seams? This is where the idea of decoherence comes in. Decoherence is like a sweeping broom in the universe, tidying away the traces of overlapping possibilities. When a quantum system becomes entangled with its surroundings, with air molecules, with light, with heat, the delicate interference between possibilities is washed out. Each outcome becomes robust, like a footprint set firmly in drying clay. An everyday picture might help. Imagine dropping a pebble into a still pond. At first, ripples spread smoothly. If you drop two pebbles close together, the ripples overlap and interfere, creating beautiful patterns. But now imagine a heavy rain begins to fall on the pond. Countless droplets strike the surface. The neat interference patterns are lost in the chaos. The ripples still exist, but they no longer combine in ways you can observe. In quantum terms, the rain is the environment, and the ripples are the overlapping possibilities. The environment erases the interference, leaving behind only stable-looking outcomes. This is why our daily lives appear classical, not quantum. The superpositions around us are constantly decohering into branches that no longer interfere. Each branch looks like a single, definite world. You never feel yourself smeared across possibilities, though in the deeper wave you still are. Here, a gentle reminder. There are no equations to memorize, no symbols to worry about. When physicists write the Schrödinger equation, they mean only that the wave of possibilities flows forward smoothly, like a river without end. When they talk about squared amplitudes, they mean the wave has thicker or thinner parts, like clouds darker or lighter in the sky. But for tonight, you can let the technicalities go. Just picture the branching paths, the footprints in clay, the raindrops dissolving interference. Some people wonder if this branching is like copying the universe again and again, billions upon billions of times. But that image is too dramatic. Nothing is being manufactured. Instead, the wave is already vast. It already contains all possible outcomes. Observation only reveals which channel you experience, like turning the page of a book and realizing the other chapters were already written. And so, we return to the forest with its diverging paths. In the quantum picture, you never truly choose just one. One version of you takes the left path, another takes the right. Each believes wholeheartedly that it was the one who decided. Each feels continuous, real, and whole. From inside the story, you cannot tell that another you has gone walking elsewhere. This raises questions we will explore further. If all paths exist, what does it mean to talk about chance? If you flip a coin, and in some branches it lands heads while in others it lands tails, why do you still speak of a 50% probability? And if there is always a branch in which you survive, does that mean you can expect survival with certainty? These questions do not have easy answers, but they guide us toward the thought experiment that will take center stage later, quantum suicide and its eerie promise of immortality. Before we reach it though, we must pause on this puzzle of probability, because if all outcomes happen, probability itself becomes slippery. And without clarity on probability, the haunting argument of quantum immortality cannot stand or fall. So for now, hold this in your mind. The world you see feels singular, but behind it lies a tapestry of branching paths, all real, all continuing. You are one thread among them, aware only of the pattern immediately around you. The rest are hidden, like stars veiled by the brightness of the day. In our next step, we will ask, in a universe where everything occurs, what does it mean to say that something is likely or unlikely at all? Picture yourself stepping into a grand old house, a place with long corridors and many doors. Each door opens into a room that looks almost like the others, but with tiny changes. A vase of flowers here, a lamp turned slightly there, a window left open. You enter one room and close the door behind you. To you, that room is the whole of reality. Yet behind the other doors, the other rooms continue, quiet but complete. This is one way to imagine what physicists mean when they talk about parallel branches in the many worlds interpretation. Each outcome of a quantum event becomes a room, a complete environment, unfolding on its own terms. Once the doors have closed, the rooms no longer communicate. You do not drift between them. You do not hear their echoes. From inside, it feels as though there is only one. The surprising part is that these rooms are not science fiction add-ons. They are what happens when you take the mathematics of quantum mechanics at face value, without inserting a sudden collapse. The wave of possibilities doesn't choose, it continues to evolve. Each outcome grows into its own isolated room. Think again about flipping a coin. In one room you see it land heads, in another you see it land tails. Both rooms are filled with air molecules, light and sound, all consistent with that outcome. Both are occupied by a version of you, just as real as the other. But each you feels like the only one. The door between them has been sealed by decoherence, that great environmental broom that sweeps away interference. The mirror metaphor returns here. Imagine you stand in front of a wall of mirrors. Each reflection shows you turning your head a fraction of a second earlier or later. They all look like you, but only one steps away into the world outside the dressing room. From your perspective, the reflections are illusions, but in the language of Everett's many worlds, those reflections are as real as you are. They simply do not overlap with your awareness anymore. This brings us to a quiet but profound puzzle. What becomes of you in all this? If there are countless continuas, versions of yourself walking through different doors, is there still one true you? Or are all the continuas equally entitled to claim that identity? Some philosophers, like Derek Parfit, suggested that identity is less like a solid chain and more like a branching tree. When a tree grows, each branch is continuous with the trunk, yet the branches are not the same as one another. Each continues life in its own direction. Parfit asked whether perhaps personal identity should be thought of the same way. What matters is not that there is one unbroken line, but that continuity and a memory carry forward, even if they diverge. Everyday life gives us small echoes of this strangeness. Think of reading a choose-your-own-adventure book. At the end of a chapter, you're asked to turn to one page if you decide to explore the cave, and another page if you return to the village. You pick one and follow it, but the other ending is still written. It exists, just not in the path you chose. Imagine now that you did not choose at all, that the book itself split into two copies on your desk, one carrying you into the cave, the other back to the village. Which book is the real story of you? In Everett's world, that is the situation every time a quantum event with multiple outcomes occurs. And because quantum events are happening constantly, not just in laboratories but in every corner of matter, the branching is relentless. Your life is not a single line but an ever-expanding forest of possibilities. This can feel dizzying. But let's return to the calmness of the image. A house with many rooms. You are in one. You sit in a chair. You hear the gentle hum of a fan. You look at the clock and see the time. That room feels entire, self-contained, with no hint of the rooms beside it. Those other rooms exist, yes, but you are not burdened by their weight. You are here in this one. It is tempting to imagine leaping between the rooms, like a character in a novel of parallel universes. But according to the physics, there is no door left open once decoherence has done its work. The split is final. Each branch is sealed. No bridge carries information across. In a way, that is a relief. You do not need to fear interference from your other selves. They cannot spill into your life, nor you into theirs. The world feels solid precisely because the branches are cut off from one another. And yet, the haunting question grows louder. If all outcomes exist, what does chance really mean? When you say a coin has a 50% chance of landing heads, you are imagining only one outcome will be real. But if both outcomes are realized in their own branches, why talk of probability at all? Do you merely mean that half of the versions of you will see heads and half will see tails? And if so, what does that mean for your expectations, right here, right now? These questions are not idle. They touch the heart of quantum immortality. Because if there is always a branch in which you survive, is it right to expect survival as a certainty? Or does the smallness of the survival branch, its thin weight in the grand wave of possibilities, matter in a way that cannot be ignored? We will take up this puzzle of probability in our next step. For now, hold the image of the house with many rooms. Imagine yourself closing one door behind. You, unaware of the others that continue. You are whole in your room, and yet somewhere else, another you is whole in theirs. The question is not whether both rooms exist. The question is how we speak of them, how we make sense of chance, and how our own sense of continuity weaves through a forest of possibilities. When you stand outside on a cloudy day and open your weather app, it might say there is a 40% chance of rain. You glance up at the sky, weigh the odds, and perhaps bring an umbrella. What that number really means is that, given many similar days with clouds like these, it will rain in about 4 out of 10 of them. You cannot know which kind of day this one will be, but probability gives you a guide. In the quantum world, probability plays a role too. But in the many worlds picture, the very idea of probability becomes slippery. If all outcomes happen, if every drop of rain and every glimmer of sun finds its own branch of reality, then why do we talk about odds at all? Traditionally, quantum mechanics gives us a rule. It says that the likelihood of a given outcome is tied to the amplitude of its wave function. To soften that language, imagine the wave as a cloud, thick in some places and thin in others. Where the cloud is thicker, outcomes are more likely. Where it is faint, outcomes are rare. The rule says, take the thickness of the cloud at a point, multiply it by itself, and that number gives the probability. In physics shorthand, people call this the Born rule. But for tonight you can let go of the symbols. Just remember, thicker cloud, more likely, thinner cloud, less likely. Now comes the puzzle. If all outcomes occur in different branches, then probability cannot mean only one outcome will really happen. They all happen. So what are we to make of the numbers? Why does your experience feel weighted, tilted toward the thick parts of the cloud, rather than scattered evenly across every possibility? Imagine tossing a coin again. In many worlds, both heads and tails appear. One version of you sees heads, another sees tails. In that sense, the probability is 100% that you will see something. But from inside your own branch, it still feels correct to say, the coin had a 50% chance of landing heads. Where does that sense of chance come from, if not from elimination of possibilities? Some philosophers and physicists have tried to answer by appealing to rational expectation. They argue that even in a branching universe, a rational agent should weight their expectations by the thickness of the cloud, by the amplitude squared. In other words, if you are about to gamble on the outcome of a quantum coin toss, you should bet in proportion to how heavy the branches will be, even though all of them will occur. This line of thought is sometimes called the decision theoretic approach. It suggests that probability is not about which world exists, but about how much of you ends up in each one. But not everyone agrees. Others argue that in a world where all outcomes occur, the notion of probability loses its bite. It becomes a bookkeeping tool, not a true measure of uncertainty. They ask, if there will always be a version of you who wins the gamble, why not bet everything recklessly? Isn't there always a branch where you come out ahead? This debate sits at the heart of the quantum immortality story. If probability truly guides rational expectations in many worlds, then the fact that a survival branch exists does not mean you should expect to experience it. It may be vanishingly thin, a ghostly thread compared to the thick ropes of branches where you do not survive. And if rational expectation tracks thickness, then it is misleading to treat survival as guaranteed. To make this more concrete, return to the weather. Suppose there is a 99% chance of rain and a 1% chance of sun. In the branching universe, both occur. One version of you gets soaked, another enjoys a picnic. But if you're deciding what to pack this morning, you will still bring an umbrella. The small branch of sunshine does not change the rational expectation that rain dominates. In the same way, the fact that some branch contains your survival does not mean it outweighs the overwhelming branches where you do not survive. Still, it is natural to feel uneasy. For each version of you, the experience is total. The one who enjoys the picnic does not care that most other branches are wet. The one who sees the coinland heads does not feel the existence of the tails branches. Each branch feels like the only one. So why should thickness matter to you personally, here and now? Why should you care about branches you cannot access? This is the strange duality of probability in many worlds. From the outside, if there were such a thing as an external perspective on the whole wave, the cloud has weight, and that weight matters. From the inside, each branch feels equally real. Reconciling these views is one of the deepest puzzles in the philosophy of quantum mechanics, and it is precisely this tension that quantum immortality tries to exploit. The argument goes, since you cannot observe your own death, you will only ever find yourself in the rare branches where you survive. From your point of view, probability collapses into certainty. But critics reply, no, rational expectations should follow the weight of branches, and those survival branches may be so thin as to be irrelevant. Tonight, we will walk carefully between these positions. We do not need to solve the philosophy of probability in a single sitting. Instead, we will gently trace how the ambiguity creates space for one of the strangest, most unsettling thought experiments. The idea of quantum suicide and its apparent promise of quantum immortality. For now, you might let the image rest in your mind, a great cloud with thicker and thinner parts representing outcomes heavy or faint. When you say something is likely, you're pointing to the denser folds of that cloud. When you say something is rare, you're noticing its faint tendrils. All the outcomes exist, but not all are equal. And in the space between the heavy and the thin, between certainty and possibility, the haunting logic of immortality takes root. Imagine sitting in a quiet room, where the only sound is the steady tick of a metronome. Each click follows the last, regular and calm. Now imagine that the ticking is tied to a hidden rule. Sometimes the next click comes, sometimes it does not. To you, though, it feels as if you only ever hear the ticks that continue. The silence, though it exists, is never part of your experience. This image gives us a way to approach one of the most unsettling thought experiments in modern physics, what has been called quantum suicide. Before we go further, let me pause here with a very clear reminder. This is not a real experiment. It is not safe, not practical, and not something anyone should attempt. It belongs only in the realm of imagination, like the cat in Schrödinger's famous box. We are not talking about actions, but about ideas. Ideas that expose the strange edges of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. The thought experiment begins with a device. Instead of a simple coin flip, imagine a trigger connected to a quantum process, say the decay of a radioactive atom. Radioactive decay is unpredictable. You cannot say exactly when a single atom will emit a particle. All you can do is describe a probability, like a dice roll written into the laws of physics. In one branch of reality, the atom decays at this moment. In another, it does not. Now imagine attaching that random trigger to a mechanism that delivers one of two outcomes. In one branch, survival. In the other, death. To keep our description soft, picture it like a lamp. If the atom decays, the lamp turns off. If it does not, the lamp stays on. Only, in the imagined version of this experiment, the difference is far more consequential. One outcome ends awareness, the other allows it to continue. From the outside perspective, if we could step back and look at the whole wave of possibilities, both outcomes occur. In one branch, the experimenter survives. In another, they do not. But from the inside, from the first-person point of view, something peculiar is suggested. The branch where awareness ends cannot be experienced. The only branches in which there is still an observer are the survival branches, which means that to the observer, it seems as though they always find themselves surviving. This is the eerie echo of the ticking metronome. The silence exists, but the listener never hears it. The only experience available is the continuation of sound. At first, this thought feels like little more than a clever trick of perspective, but stretched further, it leads to something bolder and more unsettling. If every time the experiment is run there is at least one branch where the observer survives, then the observer's experience from the inside may appear unbroken. Each time they find themselves in the surviving branch. Each time, awareness carries on. It is crucial to notice what is happening here. No claim is being made that survival is likely in the ordinary sense. From the outside, most branches may show the opposite. But because the branches without awareness cannot be observed, they vanish from the first-person perspective. Only the thin threads where survival continues are ever experienced. This is why the thought experiment is so powerful. Not because it describes something real, but because it teases apart our notions of probability, observation, and consciousness. It asks, what does it mean to assign odds if you cannot experience non-existence? What does it mean to talk about the end of awareness if by definition you cannot be present to witness it? Even the way we phrase things in everyday life shows the tension. We say, I might die tomorrow. But in quantum suicide logic, there is always a tomorrow that contains a surviving you. It may be rare, improbable, or fragile, but it is there. The question becomes, from the inside, do you simply slide along that thread, never touching the branches where you end? Let us soften this again with a simple image. Picture a hallway lined with doors. Some are locked, some are open. You walk forward, and when you reach a locked door, you do not step through. Your story continues only through the open ones. Later, when you look back, you only remember the doors that opened. The locked doors existed, but they left no mark on your experience. In the same way, the branches where awareness ends may exist, but they cannot be remembered because no one remains to remember them. As haunting as this idea is, it is not a conclusion of physics. It is a philosophical stretching of the many worlds interpretation. Physicists caution that it is deeply flawed, both scientifically and ethically. For one, death in real life is not instantaneous or binary. Consciousness fades in stages. Neural activity slows. There is no single switch that flips awareness off like a lamp. The clean separation imagined in the quantum suicide setup is unrealistic. Still, the thought experiment does what thought experiments are meant to do. It pushes us to see the boundaries of our assumptions. It asks us to think about what probability really means when all outcomes occur. It forces us to ask whether identity is tied to thick branches or thin ones, to weight, or to mere possibility. For now, let the image of the ticking metronome linger. Each tick, a survival. Each silence, real in its way but never heard. The thought experiment does not tell us how the world truly is, but it prepares us to face the strange argument that follows, the idea of quantum immortality, where this logic is extended into the future without end. Imagine again the hallway lined with doors. Each time you reach one, you find that some are locked, some are open. In ordinary life, sooner or later, you would encounter a door that does not open, the final barrier. But in the logic of the quantum suicide thought experiment, it seems that at least one door always stands open, no matter how unlikely. And each time you look back, the only doors you remember are the ones you stepped through. This is the step from quantum suicide to what people have called quantum immortality. The claim is deceptively simple. Because you cannot experience your own non-existence, you will only ever find yourself in the branches where you survive. And because survival is always possible, however improbable, you will continue to slide into those threads. From your perspective, life never ends. Let's soften this with a different picture. Imagine you are walking through a series of rooms, each with two exits. One exit leads to another room, the story continuing. The other is a dead end. But in this peculiar storybook universe, you never find yourself at the dead end. Somehow you always push through the exit that leads onward. After enough rooms, it begins to feel uncanny. You start to wonder, are you immortal within the pages of this book? That is the haunting suggestion. Each time the quantum trigger is run, the observer never experiences the outcome where awareness ceases. They only continue in the survival branches. If the experiment is repeated endlessly, the observer's perspective appears unbroken. A line of continuous awareness carried forward into improbably lucky escapes. To illustrate this, physicists sometimes describe a device tied to a quantum randomizer. Think of it as a box with a glowing light. If the quantum event goes one way, the light stays on and the observer lives. If it goes the other, the light goes dark and awareness ends. From an external view, both outcomes occur in separate branches. But from the observer's point of view, the dark branch cannot be experienced. Only the lit branch carries memory forward. Run this experiment again and again, and the observer remembers only a series of lights that never fail. Of course, this is not a real machine. It is not something anyone could build safely, nor should they ever try. It is simply a way of dramatizing the logic. Yet when stretched to its conclusion, it leads to the eerie picture of quantum immortality, that from the inside death never arrives. The outside world may see it differently. Friends and family may grieve in the vast majority of branches, but subjectively, the observer never crosses the threshold of absence. This idea carries a strange emotional pull. On the surface, it looks like a loophole against mortality, a back door out of the human condition, the thought that perhaps deep down, there will always be one version of you that wakes up tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that still. But pause for a moment and notice how strange that continuity would be. It would not mean flourishing in the way we usually imagine immortality, youth, health, and joy stretched without end. Instead, it might mean lingering in ever more improbable branches, surviving accidents that should have ended you, living through illnesses that in almost every other timeline proved fatal. Each continuation might feel more uncanny, less natural, more detached from the world of others. This is why the metaphor of walking through doors matters. In a normal story, you reach the last door and the book ends. In the quantum immortality story, the book refuses to close. The ink stretches thinner, the pages become ghostly, but still another door opens. You step through, uncertain why the story insists on continuing. Another way to picture it is with dice. Imagine rolling 2 dice again and again. The rule is that you only survive if they both land on 6. The odds of this are tiny, 1 chance in 36. After a few rolls, almost everyone else would be gone. But in this peculiar logic, you're only ever aware of the rare cases where both dice land 6. To you, the impossible becomes inevitable. Every roll shows 6s, because every roll where they don't, you are no longer present to notice. And yet, something feels hollow about this victory. You have beaten the odds, but only by inhabiting ever rarer threads of possibility. To others, your story has long ended. Only you remain, drifting in the thin edge of probability. This is the seductive and terrifying promise of quantum immortality. It whispers that you will never meet your end, that you will always find yourself on the side of survival. But it also suggests that your survival may carry you further and further away from the familiar world, from the people you love, from the weighty branches where most of existence continues. You become, in a sense, a ghost haunting the least likely corridors of the multiverse. As we move forward, we will explore why this logic is both alluring and flawed. For now, remember the image of walking through doors. Each one opens onto another tomorrow. You never face the locked doors, because in those moments you're not there to notice. The story goes on, not because survival is guaranteed, but because non-survival cannot be experienced. In the next session, we will look at why this apparent loophole has fascinated thinkers, and why it may not offer the comfort it first seems to promise. We will turn from the surface allure of immortality to the shadows that make it troubling. There is a reason quantum immortality catches the imagination so strongly. To many, it sounds like a cheat code hidden in the fabric of reality. For as long as people have lived, they have feared the finality of death. Religions and philosophies have offered comfort, the soul continuing, rebirth in new forms, or memory living on in others. But here is a different kind of whisper. Physics itself, stripped of any spiritual promises, might contain an escape route. The temptation is clear. If you cannot experience your own absence, then you will always find yourself in the worlds where you remain. From your first-person perspective, tomorrow always arrives. The sunrise always comes. You always wake up somehow, somewhere. At first glance, that sounds like a dream come true. An endless extension of the one thing we most fear losing, awareness. Imagine lying down at night with the certainty that, whatever else happens, you will wake in the morning. Imagine stepping onto an airplane with no fear, knowing there will always be a version of you who lands safely. Imagine walking through life wrapped in the strange assurance that you will never personally know the silence of death. Yet when we slow down and look more closely, this assurance begins to darken. Because immortality in this form does not promise youth, health, or happiness. It does not promise that your life will continue in the way you hope. It only suggests that awareness will cling to the surviving branches, no matter how thin, no matter how damaged. Think of it like a candle again. A strong flame burns bright, giving warmth and light. But as the wax runs low, the flame flickers, shrinking and sputtering. Sometimes it seems to vanish, only to catch again for a moment. In the story of quantum immortality, your awareness is not guaranteed to be the bright, steady flame. It may be the stubborn ember that refuses to die out, even when it no longer brings comfort. Another image. A train pulling away from the station. At first, the car is full of passengers, voices filling the air. Stop after stop, more people step off, until you find yourself riding alone. The train still moves forward, but the companionship, the shared journey, has ended. Quantum immortality suggests you remain on the train, but it cannot promise that anyone else will stay with you. This is the terrifying side of the logic. It offers survival, but not the kind of survival we long for. Instead, it suggests the possibility of surviving too long, in improbable ways, cut off from the thicker branches where the rest of the world continues. You may find yourself increasingly alone, increasingly fragile, increasingly at odds with what feels natural. It also unsettles our understanding of probability. In ordinary life, probability is what lets us prepare. If rain is likely, we bring an umbrella. If an illness is rare, we live without constant fear. But in the story of quantum immortality, probability loses its role. Even the rarest survival branch is guaranteed from the inside, because it is the only one left to experience. What should we do with that? Do we trust the weight of probability, or do we listen to the whisper that says we will always wake up tomorrow no matter what? Some thinkers warn that this is a dangerous road. If someone believed wholeheartedly in quantum immortality, they might feel tempted to act recklessly, assuming survival was certain. But survival here is not the same as thriving. It may mean persisting in branches of injury, illness, or despair. It may mean dragging onward in situations where almost every other version of you has ended. And so, the logic that at first seems comforting, you never face your own absence, becomes disturbing. It suggests a future not of peace, but of endurance stretched too far. A future where the very structure of probability is bent, and where your continuity comes at the cost of leaving behind everything else that matters. At this point in our journey, it is important to breathe and step back. These are not predictions of what will happen. They are explorations of what the many worlds interpretation might imply if pushed in unsettling directions. The scientific community is far from accepting them, and many argue they are misuses of the theory. But they do reveal how fragile our ideas of survival and identity can be when placed against the vastness of quantum possibility. So, let the image rest, a flame sputtering at the edge of going out, yet catching again. A train carrying a lone passenger forward, a hallway where another improbable door always opens. These are the promises and the warnings hidden inside the idea of quantum immortality. From here, we turn toward the consequences. If this logic were true, what would it mean for the shape of survival? For relationships, for consciousness, for the meaning of probability itself? In the next part, we step into the shadows, the disturbing implications that turn this thought from comforting to unsettling. When most people hear the word immortality, they imagine something almost magical, a life that stretches on effortlessly, health and strength preserved, like a fountain of youth hidden in the fabric of the cosmos. The phrase carries an echo of myths, golden chalices, elixirs, gods who live forever without decay. But the version suggested by the quantum immortality thought experiment is very different. It does not promise you vigor. It does not promise happiness. It promises only that awareness, however faint, clings to the narrowest branches where survival is still possible. Real death, after all, is not a switch that flips in a single instant. It is usually a process, a fading. Think of anesthesia before surgery. As the drug enters your system, awareness slips gradually. You drift into a twilight state, thoughts breaking apart, until at last the world disappears. Or consider the quiet decline of aging. Reflexes slow, memory falters, the body bends under the weight of years. These are not binary changes. They are gradual, like the sun sinking below the horizon in stages of light and shadow. If the logic of quantum immortality held, It would not stop this fading. Instead, it would suggest that you continue in whatever branches allow even a glimmer of consciousness to remain. In one branch, an illness proves fatal. In another, some improbable alignment of biology allows you to survive, but perhaps in pain or with diminished clarity. You do not vanish entirely, but neither do you live fully. You persist, flickering like a candle that refuses to go out, even when it no longer gives steady light. This image of the sputtering candle is an unsettling one. A flame burning bright is a comfort. It gives warmth to those nearby, but a flame that lingers too long, weak and uneven, throws only smoke and shadows. Quantum immortality does not guarantee the first kind of flame. It may only secure the second. Imagine surviving an accident that by every normal account should have ended you. Perhaps in one world the injuries are too great, but in another a blood vessel misses being severed by the smallest margin, a single neuron manages to fire differently, and you remain. You wake, but not whole. Each improbable escape carries you further into fragile branches where survival is possible only at great cost. This is one of the darker consequences of the thought experiment. Immortality does not mean flourishing. It may mean endurance. Not a symphony of continued life, but a single note held too long, stretched thin until it becomes dissonant. Even in philosophy, this idea is sobering. Derek Parfit once wrote about personal identity not as a solid line, but as a set of continuities, psychological, physical, and relational. If those continuities fray, does the you who remains still count as the same person? Quantum immortality pushes that question further. If what survives is a diminished version, kept alive only by improbable coincidence, is that still the life you hope to carry on? Or is it something else, a shadow of the person who once lived? The unsettling part is that you would not feel the branches where you did not survive. Those are closed doors. You would only ever know the one where you did, however frail that version of survival might be. And so the story of your awareness could continue, even if every page becomes harder to read. To make this gentler, think of a record player spinning a beloved album. At first, the sound is rich and clear. But as the needle wears down and the vinyl scratches deepen, the music becomes distorted. It still plays, but faintly, with pops and skips. If the record could somehow never stop, the music would not become eternal joy. It would become eternal distortion. This is the first shadow that falls across the idea of quantum immortality. Survival is not the same as living well. Continuity is not the same as wholeness. To endure in improbable branches may be less like a triumph over death and more like being trapped in its borderlands. And so, when we hear the phrase immortality, it is worth pausing to ask, which kind? The bright flame, steady and strong, or the sputtering ember that refuses to vanish, even when its light no longer serves? In the next session, we will turn to another shadow. The loneliness that comes from knowing your story may continue down paths where those you love do not follow. For now, let the candle image rest in your mind, a small light flickering in draught, stubborn, fragile and haunting. There is a moment in every human life when we feel the importance of others most strongly. A laugh shared across a dinner table, a hand held during illness, a familiar face greeting us at the door. These moments remind us that life is not only about persistence, but about connection. Quantum immortality, if taken seriously, unsettles this deeply. For even if you endure in some branch, the people you love may not. Think back to the image of the train. In the early stages of the journey, the carriage is crowded. Friends and family sit beside you, chatting, sharing food, watching the scenery pass. Each stop, a few step off, but others remain. The journey continues together. In ordinary life, you know the train will eventually reach a final station where everyone must leave. But in the strange logic of quantum immortality, the train does not stop for you. it keeps moving forward. And as it does, more and more of the people you care for step off into branches where you no longer continue with them. From your perspective, you remain. The train rattles on, but the carriage grows emptier. Conversations fade. The warmth of company thins into silence. This is the shadow of existential isolation, the sense that your continuity may diverge from those you love most. In practical terms, this could mean that in some improbable branches, you survive conditions that your loved ones do not, a car accident that spares you but not them, an illness that leaves you standing while their branch closes. In the logic of quantum immortality, your awareness would follow the survival thread, but theirs would not. The result is not reunion, but separation. You endure, but not together. The thought is haunting because it touches our deepest fears. We often fear death not only for ourselves, but for those we cannot bear to lose. And we often comfort ourselves with the idea that life and death are shared experiences, that we walk toward the horizon together. Quantum immortality, if it were real, would strip that symmetry away. You might linger in the thinnest of branches, but those beside you may not. The journey of awareness becomes a solitary road. This loneliness is not the ordinary kind. It is not simply being without company for a night or a week. It is loneliness at the level of existence itself, a divergence so complete that no letter, no memory, no dream can cross the gap. The doors between branches are sealed. There is no reaching back to the versions of your loved ones who stepped off at earlier stations. To bring the picture down to earth, imagine sitting at a family dinner. The table is filled with familiar voices. Now imagine that with each clink of a glass, one voice vanishes, not in front of your eyes, but in the structure of probability. One by one, those voices continue in branches you no longer share. You're left at the table, hearing the echoes of conversations that once surrounded you. The food remains, but the company fades. Some philosophers suggest that immortality without companionship is hardly immortality at all. The meaning of life is not in the bare persistence of consciousness, but in the ties that give it texture. Without others, endurance can feel hollow, like a play performed on an empty stage. Even science echoes this. Our sense of self is not built in isolation. Neuroscientists remind us that identity is shaped in constant relation to others, our families, our cultures, our conversations. Strip those away, and you're not simply left alone, you're left with a diminished sense of who you are. In this way, the survival promised by quantum immortality may not feel like survival at all. It may feel like exile from the richer, thicker branches where life with others continued. There is perhaps one more metaphor to soften this. Imagine you're playing a piece of music with a group, a quartet perhaps. The melody is shared among instruments, weaving in harmony. Then, one by one, the other instruments fall silent. You continue to play, your notes still sounding. But the harmony is gone. The music has thinned into a solo that was never meant to stand alone. The score is still being read, the bow still moves across the strings, but the beauty of the piece is lost. This is what existential isolation suggests, a survival stripped of the very things that make survival matter. Continuity without connection, presence without companionship. And so, as we walk through the implications of quantum immortality, we begin to see the irony. The idea begins as a comfort, the promise that you will never face your own end. But the deeper we go, the more it resembles something else entirely. Not immortality as gift, but immortality as solitude. In our next step, we will go further still. We will look at the nature of probability itself and how survival in thin branches turns you into something like a ghost, a presence at the edges of possibility. For now, let the image rest. A train rolling forward, one passenger left behind in an empty carriage, moving on into the dark. Close your eyes for a moment and picture yourself standing in a vast canyon. You shout, and the sound echoes back. At first, the echo is strong, rolling across the walls, but as the seconds pass it fades. The later echoes are weaker, stretched thin until they are barely more than whispers, and then silence. Quantum immortality suggests something similar for awareness. At the beginning, survival feels like the strong echo, the dominant path. You live, and your branch of reality is thick with probability. But as time goes on and improbable escapes pile up, the branches that still contain your awareness become thinner and thinner. You continue, yes, but as a kind of echo at the edges of possibility, a ghost haunting the faintest outlines of the probability cloud. To understand this, let's soften the science again. In quantum mechanics, the likelihood of outcomes is tied to what physicists call amplitude. Imagine the wave of possibility as a cloud in the sky, thick in some places, thin in others. The rule, called the Born rule, says that the chance of finding yourself in a given outcome is like the thickness of the cloud at that point multiplied by itself. Thicker regions are more likely, thinner regions are rare. In the many worlds interpretation, all outcomes happen, but not all outcomes are equal. The thick branches carry more of the total measure of existence. The thin branches are fragile wisps. Rational expectation, most philosophers argue, should track the thickness, but quantum immortality seems to ignore this. It whispers that as long as some branch remains, even the thinnest, you will find yourself there. And so, over time, you slide into the faint echoes. Imagine flipping a coin 100 times. In most branches, the sequence looks ordinary, a jumble of heads and tails. But there will also be a branch vanishingly rare, where every single flip comes up heads. If quantum immortality carried you always into survival branches, you might end up in that rare sequence. You would be the version who saw the impossible streak continue, long after others had accepted the odds. To the outside view, you would be the ghost in the data, the anomaly that should never have lasted. This picture unsettles, because it undermines our sense of belonging to the thick world, the ordinary stable likely one. Instead, it suggests survival by exile into the thinnest slivers of possibility. You may persist, but at the cost of drifting further and further from the worlds where probability concentrates, where others live their shared and predictable lives. Let's return to the canyon for a moment. The first echo is comforting. It proves your voice carried. The later echoes, faint and stretched, no longer sound like you. They are thin shadows of the original. If you lived only in those faint echoes, would you still feel real? Or would you feel like a ghost, wandering at the edge of the canyon, knowing that most of your voice had already vanished? In philosophy of identity, this raises a sharp question. If you survive only in the branches of vanishing measure, do those continuations still carry the same weight of you? Or do they feel like statistical ghosts, copies without substance? Rational expectation seems to say, no, you should not expect to find yourself there. Yet the logic of quantum immortality insists. You cannot help but do so, because the branches where you are absent cannot be experienced. The tension here is not just technical, it is emotional. People do not long for survival in the margins. We long for survival in the thick of life, where our families, our cultures, our histories continue. To imagine living only in the rarest coincidences is to imagine drifting away from everything that feels grounded. Another metaphor. Picture a card game. The deck is shuffled. Most of the time the hands are ordinary, mixed. But every so often, by chance, the cards line up into something extraordinary. All 4 aces in a single hand. If you were immortal in the quantum sense, you might always find yourself in those hands against all odds. But what is the value of winning every hand if you must play alone, in a world that looks increasingly like a deck stacked beyond recognition? This is the haunting image. Immortality not as triumph, but as spectral persistence in improbable places. Like a faint star still burning in the corner of the sky, ignored by the constellations that guide ships. Like an echo that lingers long after the song has ended. And so, quantum immortality which began as a promise of endless tomorrow, now begins to resemble something else entirely. Not eternal life, but eternal marginality. You survive, but as a ghost of probability, inhabiting branches so thin they are nearly erased from the fabric of existence. In the next session, we will push this strangeness further. For what if survival is not only thin, but also fragmented? What if awareness itself begins to flicker, breaking into pieces like frames missing from a film reel? That is the next shadow we must enter. Think for a moment about watching an old film reel. As the projector hums, the story moves forward, frame by frame. But if a few frames are missing, the movement becomes jagged. A character suddenly jumps from one place to another. The continuity is broken. You can still follow the story, but it no longer feels smooth. Now imagine if consciousness itself could feel like that. If the survival promised by quantum immortality were not a steady stream, but a series of flickering fragments. Awareness that continues, yes, but stuttering, with gaps too wide to fill. This idea is not part of standard neuroscience, but it emerges naturally when we push the thought experiment to its limits. If your awareness always clings to the survival branches, then even when the body falters, neurons firing irregularly, memory pathways fraying, senses dimming, there will still be some branch where awareness persists. But what if that awareness is not full, not continuous, not coherent? What if it is survival as scattered sparks rather than a steady flame? Picture a computer screen with a cracked display. Some pixels still glow, others are dark. The image that remains is broken, but it is still an image. In the same way, you might imagine fragments of consciousness, enough to constitute experience but incomplete, distorted, and hard to interpret. Philosophers like Derek Parfit have raised questions about personal identity in cases of duplication and fission. If your body split into two, each carrying your memories, which one would be you? Both? Neither? Quantum immortality stretches this puzzle further. What if your survival becomes not just duplication, but disintegration? Not two complete copies, but many incomplete continuas, each carrying scraps of the original. This challenges our intuition about what it means to be alive. We imagine the self as a continuous thread, weaving through time. But if survival at the edge of possibility means fragments scattered across branches, then the thread is no longer smooth. It is frayed into strands, each only partially representing what once was whole. An everyday analogy might help. Imagine a favourite song you know by heart. Normally you can hum it start to finish, the melody carrying you along. But now imagine the song played on a broken speaker, cutting in and out. A few notes ring clear, then silence, then a burst of sound again. Technically, the song is still playing. But does it feel like the same song? Or does it feel like a shadow, a ghost of music? This is the unease of fragmented consciousness. In the logic of quantum immortality, you may never experience your end directly. But that does not mean your experience is guaranteed to remain whole. It may become choppy, fractured, distorted. Survival may not mean continuation of the story as you know it, but something stranger, a reel of missing frames. And here we find ourselves in another paradox. We fear death because it seems like a hard stop, the abrupt vanishing of awareness. But what if the alternative were not endless clarity, but endless fragmentation? A kind of immortality that feels less like eternal life and more like eternal disintegration. Neuroscience reminds us that consciousness is bound to the integrity of the brain. Awareness emerges from networks of neurons firing in synchrony. Break enough of that synchrony, and experience falters. We see this in conditions like dementia, where memory breaks apart, leaving moments intact but the larger story lost. We see it in seizures, where awareness flickers. If quantum immortality clings to any surviving fragment, then continuity may mean persisting through these broken states long after a coherent self has faded. This is not a prediction. It is a philosophical extension, a way of exploring the unsettling edge of the idea, but it does highlight why many physicists and philosophers push back against the seduction of quantum immortality. What is promised is not the kind of immortality humans dream of, but something far stranger and less comforting. Let's soften this once more with imagery. Imagine sitting by a fireplace on a winter night. The logs have burned down, leaving only embers. The embers glow, then fade, then flare again briefly as a breeze stirs them. Each glow is a moment of survival. Each flicker is a fragment of awareness. The fire has not gone out entirely, but it is no longer the steady blaze it once was. That, perhaps, is the shape of immortality at the edge of possibility, a flickering consciousness, scattered and unstable. And so, with this thought, we close the circle of disturbing implications. What began as the comforting idea of never facing your own end has unfolded into shadows. Survival in damaged states, survival in isolation, survival as a ghost of probability, survival as fragments. None of these resemble the immortality we might wish for. They resemble instead the uncanny persistence of awareness beyond its natural span. In the next part of our journey, we will step away from the shadows and ask, what does this mean for how we think and act in our lives? What are the psychological, social, and ethical stakes of entertaining such an idea? For now, let the image of the flickering film reel rest in your mind. Frames missing, story stuttering, yet never fully ending. Imagine for a moment a driver approaching an intersection. The light has turned red, but instead of stopping, the driver speeds through. Why? Because they believe that in at least one version of the universe, they will survive. Perhaps, in their mind, survival is guaranteed. Somewhere, they will keep driving unharmed. The problem, of course, is obvious. In the world they actually inhabit, their choice could cause disaster, for themselves and for everyone around them. This is the danger of taking quantum immortality as more than a thought experiment. If someone believed deeply that they would always find themselves in the survival branches, they might begin to act recklessly. The reasoning would be, no matter what risk I take, there will be a version of me who survives, and that version will be the one I experience. In this mindset, consequences lose their weight. Safety precautions, caution, and even care for others might feel unnecessary. But this is precisely why scientists and philosophers are so careful about how these ideas are presented. Quantum immortality is not a scientific prediction. It is not an encouragement to gamble with your life. It is a philosophical extrapolation of the many worlds interpretation, and one that most experts consider flawed. If taken literally, it can create moral hazards, situations where the belief in guaranteed survival leads to harmful or dangerous behaviour. Think about how we use probability in everyday life. If you're told there's a small chance of rain, you might carry an umbrella. You don't think, well, somewhere there's a world where it doesn't rain, so I'll be fine. You act based on the likely outcome in your present branch, because that's the reality that matters for your choices. If you ignored probabilities altogether, life would quickly become chaotic, driving through red lights, leaving medicine untaken, walking into storms without preparation. Quantum immortality, if misunderstood, tempts people to forget this. It whispers, you'll always wake up tomorrow, no matter what you do. But this is not how responsible living works. Even if survival branches exist in the grand wave of possibilities, the overwhelming majority of branches may not contain you. And from the perspective of the people around you, your family, your friends, your community, your death is real and final. This is why ethicists insist that ideas like quantum suicide should remain firmly in the category of thought experiments. They are tools for probing the meaning of probability, identity, and observation, not guides for real decisions. The ethical responsibility here is heavy. scientists and educators must make clear this is not a loophole around mortality, and it should never be used to justify recklessness. Let's use another everyday image. Picture someone walking along the edge of a cliff. The drop is steep, the rocks jagged. Normally, caution keeps them safe. But if they truly believed in quantum immortality, they might step too close to the edge, telling themselves, "In some branch, I will not fall." The flaw is clear. The branch where they fall may not be experienced by them, but it will be experienced by everyone watching, by everyone left behind. To those people, the loss is not erased. It is real, with grief and consequences that cannot be undone. There's also the question of responsibility. Life is not lived in isolation. Every choice ripples outward, affecting others. To believe in quantum immortality as personal insurance is to ignore the shared fabric of reality. You may imagine surviving, but others cannot follow you into your improbable branch. They live with the outcome in this one. Recklessness here is not just self-endangerment, it is a failure of care for others. Some thinkers even suggest that this is the true danger of the idea. Not that it might be true, but that people might live as though it were. Immortality, even imagined, can erode caution, humility, and compassion. The belief can distort how we weigh risks, leading to choices that harm the fragile, finite lives we actually inhabit. And so, when we reflect on quantum immortality, we must hold this ethical boundary firmly. It is interesting to imagine. It is provocative to debate. But it is not a belief to live by. To do so would be like driving blindfolded, saying, "Somewhere, a version of me avoids the crash." True enough, but meaningless in practice and devastating for the branch you actually inhabit. Let's soften this with one final metaphor. Think of life as walking across a frozen lake. The ice is strong in most places, but cracks appear here and there. You tread carefully, watching where you step. If you were to believe in quantum immortality, you might charge ahead recklessly, saying, "Even if I fall through, another version of me walks safely on." But the truth is that your experience, your body, and the people who depend on you are bound to the ice beneath your actual feet. The cracks are real, the risks are real, and the responsibility to step with care remains. This is the heart of the moral hazard, the danger of confusing speculation with license. As we move forward, we'll see another trap waiting, the illusion that survival itself confirms the theory, when in fact it cannot. For now, remember the red light, the cliff edge, the frozen lake. In each case, responsibility lies in this branch, this life, the one where others share your path. Imagine a lottery in which millions of people buy tickets. At the drawing, only a handful win. The winners step forward, celebrating, holding their slips high. But the vast majority, the losers, simply fall silent, never reporting back. If you only ever saw the winners, you might believe the lottery was easy to win, even certain. That is the illusion at the heart of quantum immortality. The thought experiment suggests that because you cannot experience your own absence, you will always find yourself among the winners, the survivors. And so, from your first-person perspective, survival feels inevitable. Each time you awaken, each time you remember continuing, it seems like proof. Look, I made it again. The theory must be right, but in reality this survival cannot confirm anything, because the branches in which you did not continue are invisible to you. This is what philosophers call unfalsifiability, a claim that cannot be tested, because no possible outcome could ever count as disproof. In the case of quantum suicide, there is no way for an observer to witness their own death and report back that the theory failed. Every observation of survival is guaranteed, not because the theory is true, but because absence cannot be experienced. An everyday anchor may help. Suppose you wanted to test whether people ever truly fall asleep. You walk around a room and ask, "Are you awake?" Everyone you ask answers yes. Of course they do. the sleepers cannot respond. You might conclude, mistakenly, that no one ever sleeps. The data looks solid, but only because you never heard from those who could not answer. Quantum immortality falls into the same trap. Each instance of survival seems like supporting evidence, but it is an illusion created by selective observation. The non-survivors are silent by definition. You will never hear from them, and so you find yourself in a biased sample, one that cannot reveal the truth of the whole. This is why physicists like Simon Saunders and philosophers like Shangao argue that quantum suicide is not a real experiment. It does not test the many worlds interpretation. It cannot distinguish between collapse theories and branching ones, because the data you collect, your own survival, was never in doubt to begin with. It is baked into the setup. Think of it like tossing a coin behind a curtain. You never see the result. But if someone tells you afterward, well, of course it landed heads, because otherwise you wouldn't be here to ask. You have not learned anything about the coin. You've only learned about the limits of observation, and this brings us to the subtle danger. For someone who finds the idea emotionally appealing, every moment of continued life may feel like further proof. See, I survived again. The theory holds. In truth, this is a confirmation trap, a loop that reinforces itself no matter what. The longer you live, the more convinced you might become, precisely because the branches where you do not live are forever beyond your awareness. The ethical concern here is sharp. When people hear about quantum immortality, some may be tempted to interpret their daily survival as validation. But survival is not evidence. It is simply the condition of being an observer at all. If you're alive to reflect, you are necessarily in a survival branch. That does not mean survival is guaranteed, nor that immortality awaits. An analogy with weather can soften this. Suppose you wake up each morning and notice that the sky's never empty. There is always something. Sun, clouds, rain. You conclude, I must be in the branch where the sky is visible, therefore the sky is eternal. But that conclusion is faulty. The sky may change, it may storm, it may even darken into night. Your observation that it's visible now tells you only about your current moment, not about an unbroken future. This is the heart of the trap, mistaking the necessity of observation for evidence of immortality. It is a subtle shift, but one that can profoundly distort how we interpret our experience. Some thinkers frame it more bluntly. Quantum immortality is unfalsifiable, and unfalsifiable ideas cannot serve as science. They can be philosophy, speculation, even stories that help us probe the edges of meaning. But they cannot be tests of the universe, because no possible observation can contradict them. And yet, this is also what makes the idea so sticky in the imagination. Each morning you open your eyes feels like a renewed confirmation. Each improbable escape, each lucky turn can be woven into the story. I am still here. Perhaps I cannot leave. It is easy to see how someone might fall into this loop. To step out of it requires humility, the willingness to say, my survival tells me nothing about branches I cannot see. It requires trust in the shared weight of probability, the consensus of science, and the recognition that theories must be testable to be meaningful. So let the image linger. The rigged lottery where only the winners report, the room where only the awake answer, the coin tossed behind a curtain. Each seems like evidence of certainty, but in truth, they are illusions of perspective. Survival does not confirm immortality. It only confirms that you are still alive, here, in this moment. And that was always the case. In our next step, we will turn from logic to feeling. For even if quantum immortality cannot be proven, imagining it raises deep questions about authenticity, relationships, and meaning. If survival carried you endlessly into improbable branches, would life still feel like life? Or would it dissolve into loneliness and despair? That is the path we will walk in the following session. Think for a moment about holding a photograph that has been left too long in the sun. The colours have begun to fade, the faces are still visible but less vivid. You remain looking at the picture, but the world it represents has grown pale, almost ghostly. This is one way to imagine what life might feel like if quantum immortality were true. You would continue, but in branches where the richness of connection, the authenticity of relationships has slipped away. At the heart of being human is not only the fact of awareness, but the quality of it. We live through relationships, through shared experiences, through the presence of others who recognize and respond to us. Our identity is not just a solitary flame, it is shaped like a campfire, burning brighter because of the logs others add to it. If quantum immortality led us into improbable branches where others no longer followed, then what would remain is awareness without companionship, a flame that glows but alone. Philosophers sometimes describe this as an authenticity crisis. If you survive in branches where the probability of connection has thinned, where loved ones are absent, where events unfold unnaturally, the life you live may feel less real, less grounded. It is not that the experience is false. To you, it will feel whole in the moment, but it may lack the resonance of shared reality, the harmony that comes from living in the thicker branches where most of humanity continues. Imagine again the train metaphor. In the beginning, the carriage was full. You laughed with fellow travellers, shared meals, looked out the window together. But as improbable survivals accumulate, more and more passengers step off. Eventually you ride on alone. The train continues, but the journey is no longer shared. The authenticity of travel has drained away. Or picture walking through a familiar neighbourhood, but each time you turn a corner, more of the houses are empty, their windows dark. You are still there. You still walk the streets. But the community that gave the place its meaning has vanished. Survival without companionship can feel like a hollow continuation, a shell of life rather than life itself. Worse still, quantum immortality suggests that this continuation might never end. If non-existence cannot be experienced, then awareness may cling forever to the branches that remain, however improbable. This could lead not to comfort, but to despair. Imagine being trapped in suffering with no release, pain that cannot end, fatigue that cannot fade, a body that falters but refuses to close its story. Hope itself might erode in such a scenario. Instead of immortality as gift, it becomes immortality as burden. Neuroscience adds another layer here. Consciousness is fragile, built from delicate patterns of neurons firing in synchrony. When illness or injury disrupts those patterns, awareness can become fractured, confused, or diminished. If quantum immortality ensured that some version of consciousness always remained, it might mean persisting through states of confusion or pain, branches where quality of life is deeply compromised. The thought is chilling because it transforms immortality into endurance with no guarantee of joy. This is why, for many, the idea of endless survival is not comforting but frightening. Mortality, though difficult to face, also brings closure. It allows life to have shape, like a story with a beginning, middle, and end. Without an end, the story may stretch on, but it risks losing coherence, losing meaning. A photograph endlessly faded is no longer a photograph you recognize. Let's soften this with music. A symphony is beautiful not because it plays forever, but because it rises and resolves. A final chord brings rest. If the symphony stretched on without resolution, repeating fragments without closure, the music would lose its power. In the same way, life gains meaning from its finitude. Quantum immortality, if real, would rob us of that resolution, leaving us suspended in a melody that never ends, even after beauty is drained from it. And yet, this is not how we live now. Our lives are shared, finite, and authentic precisely because they are bounded. The relationships we cherish gain their poignancy from time's limits, A hug is precious because it does not last forever. A photograph is meaningful because it captures a moment that will never return. Mortality gives these things weight. Immortality, at least in this thought experiment's version, risks stripping that weight away. So as we step back, we see that quantum immortality, far from being a gift, might be a curse. It could lead to lives that feel increasingly hollow, lonely and inauthentic. It could turn survival into a burden rather than a blessing. And this is why, even as we explore the idea with curiosity, we must hold on to our humility. The world we share here, finite though it may be, is the world that carries meaning. Let the photograph image linger, faded but still precious. Let the symphony metaphor rest, music made beautiful because it ends. These remind us that mortality, though difficult, is also part of what makes life rich. In the next part of our journey, we will turn from the emotional to the scientific. We will explore why physicists and philosophers find quantum immortality unsound, and what their critiques reveal about probability, identity, and the nature of consciousness itself. Step outside on a cloudy day, and you'll often ask yourself a simple question. Will it rain? You might check a forecast which tells you there's a 70% chance of showers. You understand what that means. If you repeated this kind of day many times, in most of them, rain would come. You act accordingly. Maybe you take an umbrella, maybe you wear a coat. This is the ordinary role of probability. It doesn't guarantee what will happen, but it guides our expectations and choices. It helps us live sensibly under uncertainty. In the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, this everyday logic of probability encounters a strange problem. Because if all outcomes occur, if every flip of a coin leads to both heads and tails in separate branches, then what does it mean to say that something is likely? If both outcomes exist, what role does probability play? This is what physicists and philosophers call the measure problem. To soften the science, in quantum theory, the wave of possibilities has thicker and thinner regions like a cloud in the sky. Where the cloud is thicker, outcomes are said to be more probable. The rule, known as the Born rule, says that the chance of finding an outcome is given by the thickness of the cloud, multiplied by itself. Thicker cloud, higher chance, thinner cloud, lower chance. But in many worlds, you never find just one outcome. Every outcome exists in some branch. The question becomes, why should the thickness of the cloud matter if all outcomes happen anyway? Why should you expect rain more often than sun, if in some branch you will always see each? Think of it like this. Imagine a book that branches into many chapters. Some chapters are long, detailed, and full of events. Others are short, barely a page. If you pick up the book at random, you're more likely to land in a long chapter simply because it contains more words. The measure of the chapter is larger. In the same way, physicists argue that thicker branches carry more of the measure of existence. They aren't just possible, they are heavier in the overall wave. Some philosophers, like David Wallace and Hilary Greaves, have tried to show that rational agents inside many worlds should still act as if the Born rule is true. They argue that even though all outcomes occur, a sensible decision-maker should place their bets according to the thickness of the cloud, just as if probability worked normally. It's a bit like saying, if you're packing for the weather, bring the umbrella when the thickest branches show rain, even though somewhere a version of you enjoys sunshine. But critics push back. Physicist Jacques Mallet, among others, has argued that without a clear link between measure and experience, probability loses its meaning. From your own perspective, he says, the mere existence of a survival branch is not enough to guarantee you will experience it. If you ignore measure, then quantum immortality becomes misleading. Yes, some branches always contain survival. But if their measure shrinks towards zero, they are like pages at the back of the book that grow thinner and thinner until they are almost unreadable. Should you really expect to find yourself there? This is where the comfort of quantum immortality begins to erode under scientific scrutiny. its promise relies on ignoring measure. It whispers, as long as one branch exists, you will continue. But science replies, not all branches are equal. The weight of the wave matters. In other words, you cannot dismiss probability just because all outcomes happen. The thick branches dominate experience. The thin ones are like ghosts, mathematically real but practically irrelevant. An everyday metaphor helps here. Imagine standing by a river that splits into many streams. Some streams are wide, deep and strong. Others are narrow trickles. If you toss a leaf into the current, the odds are overwhelming it will travel down the wider streams. The trickles still exist, but most of the river's water, most of its measure, flows elsewhere. The leaf does not care about the tiny trickles, it follows the weight of the water. In the same way, rational expectation follows the thicker branches of the quantum wave. So what does this mean for quantum immortality? It means that simply pointing to the existence of a survival branch is not enough. The key question is, how much measure does that branch carry? If survival becomes confined to branches of vanishing measure, then expecting to continue in them may be no more sensible than expecting your leaf to float up the bank instead of following the river. This critique does not make the thought experiment less haunting, but it does make it less convincing as a picture of reality. The measure problem reminds us that probability is not erased in many worlds. It is transformed, but it still matters. Ignoring it risks confusing possibility with expectation and survival with flourishing. Let the image of the river linger. Wide streams and tiny trickles, all real but not equal. Quantum immortality lives in the trickles. Probability, measure and rational life live in the river. In the next session, we will explore another critique, that quantum suicide, the supposed experiment to prove many worlds, cannot actually test anything at all. It is unfalsifiable by design, like asking only the awake if sleep exists. Imagine asking a room full of people a question. Are you awake? Every person you hear from answers yes. You might be tempted to conclude that no one ever sleeps, but of course that would be a mistake. The sleepers cannot answer. Your sample is biased. The very setup ensures you will only hear from those still conscious. This simple thought illustrates why quantum suicide cannot serve as an experiment. In its design, only the survival branches contain an observer. Only those branches can be reported from. The branches where the observer has died are silent by definition. And so, any attempt to test the many worlds interpretation this way is doomed to appear to succeed. The observer always finds themselves alive because the dead cannot speak. This is what philosophers call unfalsifiability. A claim is unfalsifiable if no possible observation could prove it wrong. And unfalsifiable claims, however interesting, cannot be part of science. Science relies on hypotheses that can, in principle, be tested and contradicted by evidence. If every possible outcome counts as support, the idea stops being scientific and becomes a story, a speculation, a philosophical curiosity. Quantum suicide falls into this category. Imagine someone building such a device, though to be clear, no one ever should. Each time they activate it, they would, by design, only ever remember the times it left them alive. They would interpret this as confirmation. See, I survived again. Many worlds must be true. But this is an illusion created by selective observation. The other branches, where they did not survive, cannot contribute to the evidence. Another way to picture it is a coin tossed behind a curtain. Suppose you want to know if the coin is fair, but the rule is this: you will only be told the outcome if it is heads. If it lands tails, you hear nothing. After 100 tosses, you have heard heads 100 times. Does that mean the coin is rigged? No, it means the test was designed to hide half of the data. In the same way, quantum suicide hides the non-survival outcomes from view, leaving the observer with a misleading sample of reality. This is why physicists and philosophers emphasize that quantum suicide is not a valid experiment. It cannot distinguish between interpretations of quantum mechanics. Collapse theories and many worlds alike predict that the observer will always report survival, because reporting requires being alive. No new information is gained. The problem is subtle, but important. In science, even the most elegant idea must bow to the rule of testability. Einstein's theories of relativity, for instance, made bold predictions about how light would bend around the sun, and those predictions could be checked against observation. Quantum suicide makes no such predictions that can be verified from the first-person perspective. Every outcome is compatible with the claim, and so no outcome can falsify it. An everyday analogy helps make this softer. Imagine you wanted to test whether people ever lose their voices. You go to a concert hall and ask each singer to sing. Every voice rings out. You might conclude, clearly no one ever goes hoarse, but of course that's wrong. The singers with no voice could not perform, and so they were invisible to your survey. Your conclusion was based on incomplete data, baked into the way you asked the question. So too with quantum immortality. Every morning you wake, every memory of continued awareness feels like a confirmation, but it is not. It is simply the consequence of being unable to observe your own absence. It tells you nothing about the truth of many worlds, or about the nature of probability, or about whether consciousness really continues forever. This is not to say that the thought experiment has no value. Its value is philosophical, not empirical. It helps us probe questions about identity, about the meaning of probability, about what it feels like to live with uncertainty. But as a test of physics, it fails, and this failure is not minor. It is structural. It lies in the very design of the idea. The danger, of course, is that someone might not see this. They might believe that their own survival is proof of the theory and live recklessly, convinced that they have confirmed many worlds with their own life. But in truth, nothing has been tested, nothing has been proven. The silence of the other branches cannot speak. Let's return to our metaphors. The lottery where only winners report, the room where only the awake can answer, the coin behind the curtain that only announces heads. All of these feel like victories, but they are illusions of perspective. Survival in quantum suicide feels like evidence, but it is only evidence that you are still here, and that was always certain. The unfalsifiability critique does not drain the thought experiment of its fascination. It simply places it where it belongs, not in the laboratory, but in the philosophy seminar, the bedtime story, the imaginative exploration. A place where we can safely play with the edges of logic without confusing speculation for fact. In the next session, we will turn to another critique, the boundaries of physics and neuroscience. Even if quantum immortality were logically consistent, it collides with what we know about the brain and consciousness. Awareness is not free-floating. It is tied to the physical structures of the body, and when those break down, the song of the self falters. That is the next shadow we must enter. Imagine listening to a violin. Its strings vibrate, the wooden body resonates, and sound fills the room. The music feels alive, flowing, perhaps even eternal in its beauty. But what if the violin is broken? If the strings snap or the body cracks, the song stops. The melody does not float away, continuing on its own. It was always bound to the instrument that produced it. This is how many scientists see consciousness. It is not a free-floating entity, able to slip between branches of the universe like a ghost. It is a pattern, an emergent property of the brain. Neurons firing in synchrony, chemicals flowing in circuits, electrical pulses shaping awareness. When the brain stops functioning, the melody stops. There is no evidence that it detaches and drifts elsewhere. Physicist Sean Carroll puts it plainly. In the framework of modern physics, there is no room for an extra soul particle, no hidden law that preserves consciousness independent of matter. The equations we use to describe the universe, from quantum mechanics to relativity, are remarkably successful. They account for every experiment we have ever performed, and within those equations there is no gap where a separate immaterial consciousness can slip in. In the quantum immortality thought experiment, the assumption is that awareness will always find itself in survival branches. But neuroscience challenges this directly. Awareness is fragile, tied to biology. When neurons die from lack of oxygen, awareness fades. When brain tissue is damaged, personality and memory change. When anesthetic molecules block receptors, consciousness disappears, only to return later when the chemistry is restored. Each of these shows that the song of the mind is inseparable from the instrument of the brain. An everyday example makes this vivid. Consider a lamp. Electricity flows through the circuit and the bulb glows. The light fills the room, but if the bulb shatters or the current stops, the glow ends. It does not move to another bulb in another room. The light was always the product of the system. Consciousness in this view is the glow of the brain's circuitry. Without the circuitry, there is no glow. This is not to say that quantum mechanics plays no role in the brain. At the level of molecules, quantum processes are everywhere. But there is no evidence that these processes create branching survival for awareness itself. Decoherence happens almost instantly in biological systems, washing away delicate quantum effects. The brain, as far as we know, operates at scales where classical physics, the physics of neurons and signals, dominates. Some philosophers have speculated that consciousness might involve quantum processes in a special way. But so far, experiments give us no reason to think so. Neuroscience continues to map the brain's activity to mental states with growing precision. Each discovery points toward consciousness as something the brain does, not something that exists outside it. And so, when we place quantum immortality against the boundary of neuroscience, a contradiction appears. If survival in improbable branches means surviving in damaged or partial states, the biology of the brain may not even permit coherent awareness to continue. It may not be possible for the melody to linger once the instrument has truly broken. The assumption that awareness can choose branches independent of biology is unsupported. This matters because it reframes the haunting promise of immortality. If consciousness depends entirely on physical structures, then the idea of awareness sliding into improbable survival branches collapses. The branches may exist in the wave of quantum possibilities, but without a functioning brain to sustain the pattern, there is no self to inhabit them. They are like empty rooms in a house. Real, perhaps, but unoccupied. Let's return to the violin one last time. When the music plays, it feels alive, flowing, as though it could go on forever. But you know it cannot. The strings will loosen, the bow will wear, the body will eventually rest. The song ends not because music itself has vanished from the universe, but because the instrument that carried it has stopped. Consciousness, many scientists argue, is the same. It does not slip away into another world when the instrument breaks. It ceases because it was never separate to begin with. This critique strikes at the very heart of quantum immortality. It reminds us that survival is not a matter of probabilities alone, but of physical possibility. The body, the brain, the networks of neurons and blood and chemistry, these are the foundation of awareness. When they are gone, the continuity of self is gone too. That may sound sobering, but it is also grounding. It ties us back to the reality we share, a reality where life is precious because it is fragile, where every moment of awareness is valuable precisely because it will not last forever. Far from despair, this view can be a source of gratitude. And so, as we step further into the scientific critiques, we see that quantum immortality is not only undermined by probability and measure, but also by the boundaries of physics and biology. Awareness is not free-floating. It is embodied, fragile, and finite. And perhaps it is that finitude that gives life its richness. In the next session, we will explore one final critique, the fragility of identity itself. If branching creates countless continuas of you, what does it even mean to say that your survival is guaranteed? When the river splits, which branch carries the true self? Picture a river flowing through a valley. At first it is one strong current, moving steadily forward, but then it splits into two streams, and then into many smaller ones. Each stream carries water from the same source. Each moves with its own twists and turns. If someone asked you, which one is the true river, you might hesitate. All of them are. And yet, none of them is the single river you once knew. This is the puzzle of personal identity in the many worlds interpretation. If the universe splits at every quantum event, then so do you. Countless continuas of your life branch away, each with your memories, your habits, your sense of self. Each one feels authentic, but they cannot all be the single you. What then does it mean to say that you survive? Philosopher Derek Parfit explored puzzles like this long before quantum immortality was imagined. He asked us to think about a thought experiment. Suppose your brain could be copied perfectly into another body. Now there are two people, each with your memories and personality. Which one is really you? Both? Neither? Parfit suggested that identity may not be a sharp line at all. Instead, it may be more like continuity, overlapping patterns of memory and character that can split just like a river. If Parfit was right, then quantum immortality becomes even stranger. When you say, "I will always survive," which eye do you mean? The branch where you continue? The others where you don't? If identity is not a single thread but a branching web, then the claim that you are immortal begins to dissolve. At best, some continuas of you survive. At worst, the concept of you surviving at all is ill-defined. An everyday metaphor helps here. Think about looking in a set of mirrors angled around you. Each reflection turns slightly, but all look convincingly like you. You recognize them, even though you know they are not the same image. Now imagine those reflections stepping out of the glass and walking away. Which one is the real continuation of you? All of them? None of them? The question resists a simple answer. This fragility of identity undermines the promise of quantum immortality. If survival simply means that some continuas of your life exist, then it is no longer the personal guarantee it first appeared to be. It is not that you continue in an unbroken line. It is that some versions of you persist, each claiming authenticity, while others fade. And here lies the unsettling truth. If you already accept branching identity, then death is not a single event but a gradual divergence. Some continuas go on, others do not. From the inside, each continua feels whole. But the notion of a single you, experiencing only survival, becomes slippery, perhaps incoherent. Consider again the river metaphor. When the main current splits into many streams, each stream carries the story forward. But none can claim to be the sole continuation of the river. The identity of the river was always provisional, a matter of perspective. So too with the self. In a branching universe, the identity you hold on to may be less like a single chain of links, and more like a tree splitting endlessly into twigs. This raises an important philosophical point. Quantum immortality relies on a very specific sense of self, that there is one continuous subject of experience always finding themselves in the surviving branch. But if identity itself is fragile, then the idea loses its meaning. There is no single you sliding endlessly forward. There are only continuas, each real in their own branch, each unaware of the others. The promise of immortality dissolves into the reality of multiplicity. Neuroscience reinforces this fragility. The self is not a solid entity but a construct of the brain. Memory, personality, and continuity are stitched together by neural processes that can falter or change. Brain injury can alter personality. Illness can erode memory. Even in ordinary life, the you of today is not identical to the you of 10 years ago. Continuity is real, but it is not absolute. It is a pattern, not an indivisible core. So when the many worlds interpretation suggests that countless continuas exist, neuroscience nods in recognition. The self was never as solid as we imagined. It was always a construction, fragile, malleable and contingent. Quantum immortality then promises too much. It speaks of a single unbroken you enduring forever. But what physics and philosophy reveal is a different picture. Survival as branching, continuities, fragile and uncertain. Let's soften this with music. Imagine a melody played on a piano. At first, the notes follow one another, forming a recognizable tune. But then the pianist begins to improvise, splitting the melody into variations. One hand plays one version, the other plays another. Each variation is beautiful, but the original tune is lost in the branching. If you asked, which one is the true melody? The answer might be all of them, or none. The identity of the tune was never a single line. It was always capable of branching. So too with you. The survival promised by quantum immortality is not the continuation of a single line, but the scattering of variations. Each feels authentic, but none can claim the exclusive title of you. This fragility does not make life meaningless. If anything, it makes it precious. The identity you hold is not guaranteed forever, not even within the many worlds. It is fragile, contingent, bound to memory and body, and the choices you make today. That fragility, far from being a weakness, is part of what gives life its poignancy. And so, as we step back, we see why many philosophers and scientists doubt quantum immortality. It is not only undermined by the measure problem, not only unfalsifiable, not only unsupported by neuroscience, it is also confused about identity itself. The promise of a single you continuing forever may be comforting in imagination, but in reality the self is a river that splits, a melody that branches, a pattern that fades and reforms. In the next part of our journey, we will leave the scientific critiques behind and turn to broader reflections. We will explore alternative lenses, from panpsychism to Wheeler's participatory universe, not as truths, but as ways of gently reframing our place in reality. For now, let the river image linger, streams diverging, each carrying water forward, none able to claim they are the only river. By now, we've walked through the strange logic of quantum immortality, its promises, its shadows, and the critiques that unravel it. We've seen how probability still matters, how neuroscience ties awareness to the body, and how identity itself is fragile when branches multiply. And yet, after so much analysis, a question lingers. Are there other ways to think about consciousness and reality? Ways that don't promise immortality but still invite reflection? Philosophy and physics alike are filled with such lenses. They do not offer certainty, but they enrich the imagination. Each one is like a language describing the same feeling. Love, for instance. In English, in French, in Japanese, the words differ, but the heart behind them is shared. In the same way, different frameworks describe our relationship to the universe. They may not all be literally true, but they shine light on different facets of the mystery. One such lens is panpsychism. This is the idea that mind, or something like it, is a fundamental feature of the universe. Instead of consciousness emerging only from complex brains, panpsychism suggests that awareness, in some minimal form, may be woven into the fabric of matter itself. A grain of sand, a drop of water, a drifting leaf, each may hold the faintest glimmer of experience, as natural as mass or charge. In this view, your consciousness is not an exception carved out of lifeless matter, but an elaboration of something present everywhere. This does not mean that rocks think or that atoms compose poetry. Rather, it means that the building blocks of reality may already contain proto-conscious qualities, the seeds of awareness that, when combined, give rise to minds like ours. To those who favour this idea, the strangeness of quantum mechanics feels less alien. because the universe itself is already participatory at every level. Another lens comes from the physicist John Wheeler, who once described the universe as an it from bit. In his view, the ultimate foundation of reality is not matter or energy, but information. What we call particles and forces may be manifestations of deeper patterns of information encoded in the yes or no of measurement outcomes. If this is true, then consciousness may not be a latecomer to the cosmos, but a co-actor, one that helps crystallize information into reality. Wheeler called this the participatory universe, the idea that observers are not passive spectators but part of the act of creation itself. Imagine again the analogy of language. One word by itself is only a fragment, but when words are spoken and heard, when they interact, they shape meaning. In Wheeler's participatory vision, reality is not a book already written, but a conversation. Observers, by asking questions and making measurements, are part of the dialogue that brings the world into focus. These ideas are not mainstream physics. Panpsychism is debated mostly in philosophy of mind. Wheeler's it from bit remains a poetic metaphor more than a tested theory. But they offer something quantum immortality cannot, a sense of connection rather than isolation. Instead of endless survival at the margins, they suggest that consciousness is already bound to the universe in deep, intrinsic ways. An everyday metaphor can make this gentle. Think about standing in a kitchen where several languages are spoken. One person says love in English, another says amour in French, another says AI in Japanese. The sound differs, but the feeling is shared. Panpsychism, it from bit, and many worlds are like these languages, each describing our place in the cosmos in a different tongue. None gives us certainty, but each enriches our sense of wonder. There is comfort in this plurality, for even if quantum immortality collapses under critique, the deeper question remains: what is the relationship between consciousness and reality? And here, we have many lenses to look through, each refracting the light differently. Of course, we must be careful. These frameworks are not proofs. They are not tickets to immortality or guarantees of cosmic design. They are invitations to reflection, gentle mirrors to hold up to the mystery of being. Their value lies not in certainty, but in the way they soften the edges of our questions, giving us more than one way to see. And perhaps that is the lesson, that no single story can capture the whole. Reality may be too vast for one language, one metaphor, one theory. By listening to many, we remind ourselves of humility. We remind ourselves that our place in the universe is not fixed, but part of a larger unfolding. So let these alternative lenses rest in your mind. The universe is seeded with mind itself. The universe is woven from information. The universe is participatory dialogue. They may not solve the puzzle of mortality, but they remind us that we're not alone in our wondering, that countless thinkers have looked into the same night sky and asked the same questions in different tongues. In the next session, we will return more closely to ourselves. We will reflect on the meaning of finitude, why mortality, rather than being a curse, may be the very thing that gives life its beauty. For now, imagine standing in that kitchen of languages, hearing love spoken in many voices, each different, each true in its own way, each pointing to the same mystery. Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff as the sun sinks below the horizon. The sky is painted in bands of orange, pink and violet. The air is cooling, the day is slipping away. You pause, not because sunsets are rare, but because they end. The beauty is sharpened by its transience. If the sun never set, the colours would lose their poignancy. They would be wallpaper instead of wonder. Mortality is like that sunset. It frightens us, yes, but it also gives shape to life. The fact that our time is limited sharpens our appreciation. A conversation with a loved one matters because it cannot be repeated endlessly. A moment of laughter becomes precious because it will fade into memory. Finitude is not only a boundary, it is a source of meaning. This is where quantum immortality, however haunting, may obscure the truth. By imagining survival without end, it tempts us to think that endlessness is what we long for. But what we truly long for is not infinite duration. It is depth, connection, and resonance within the span we have. Immortality, if stripped of those qualities, would be a barren gift. Mortality, though finite, gives us the chance to cherish. Everyday life reminds us of this constantly. Think of a bouquet of flowers on a table. Their beauty lies in their fragility. You lean in to smell them because you know they will not last. Or think of a holiday with family. The meal is savoured not because it fills every hunger forever, but because it gathers people together for one night, before dispersing again. We learn to love these things, not despite their endings, but because of them. Philosophers have often framed it this way. If we lived forever, much of what we value might fade into monotony. Projects could be delayed endlessly. Urgency would vanish. Meaning thrives on limitation. Death, unwelcome as it is, gives life its intensity, like the sharp taste of salt that makes a dish come alive. Neuroscience echoes this truth in a quieter register. Memory is not a perfect recording but a fragile trace. Each time we recall, the trace changes. Our lives are not built from permanence but from impermanence. And yet, those impermanent memories form the very fabric of identity. They remind us that what matters is not eternal repetition, but fleeting presence. Returning to physics, the many worlds interpretation itself hints at this. Even if branches multiply endlessly, your experience is a single thread. You do not live in all of them at once. You live here, now, in this branch. And this branch is finite. Its finitude is what makes it yours. To live as though immortality were guaranteed would be to overlook the weight of this one path, this one fragile chance to be present. Let's soften this with music. A symphony moves toward its close. The final chord resonates, then fades. If the music never ended, it might dissolve into background noise. But because it ends, the silence after it feels full, meaningful. The concert is remembered, treasured, precisely because it had a beginning and an end. In the same way, our lives gain their resonance from the fact that they will not last forever. This perspective does not deny the strangeness of quantum immortality. It acknowledges the allure, the promise of never meeting an end. But it reminds us that meaning often comes from the opposite. A sunset is beautiful because it ends. A flower is cherished because it wilts. A life is meaningful because it is bounded. So, as we step back from the thought experiment, we find humility. We do not need immortality to make life precious. We need finitude. The brevity of our time is not a curse, but the very condition that allows us to care. Imagine again the sunset. The horizon swallows the light and night gathers. You breathe in, knowing tomorrow will bring another dawn, but not this one. This one is unique, and that is why it matters. In our next session, we will close this journey. We will gather the threads of speculation, philosophy, and science, and rest in a gentle farewell. For now, hold on to this. The beauty of life is not in its endlessness, but in its limits. Hello again, dear traveller. We've walked far tonight, from the branching halls of the quantum world to the fragile music of the brain, from eerie promises of survival without end to the quiet reassurance of life's natural boundaries. And now, as we approach the close, it's time to rest, to let the questions settle like dust in a beam of evening light. Quantum immortality began as a haunting idea, that you could never meet your own absence, that awareness must always find itself in survival branches. At first, it sounded like a hidden doorway in the laws of physics, a way to slip past mortality. But as we followed the thought, we found shadows gathering. Survival without flourishing, continuity without connection, probability stretched to the edge of meaning, an identity itself frayed into many continuas rather than a single enduring you. Science reminded us to be cautious. The measure problem showed that not all branches are equal. Thick currents carry experience, thin trickles fade into irrelevance. The problem of unfalsifiability showed that no experiment can prove the idea. Survival is always observed. Absence never is. Neuroscience told us that awareness is bound to the brain, like a song bound to its violin. And philosophy revealed that the self is not a single chain of links, but a pattern, fragile and branching, never as solid as we might hope. Along the way, we also looked through other lenses: panpsychism, the suggestion that mind may be fundamental, present everywhere in small ways; Wheeler's participatory universe, the thought that reality itself is a dialogue, shaped by information and observation. These were not answers, but mirrors, giving us more ways to reflect on the mystery of being. And then we came home to ourselves, to the insight that meaning may not lie in endless survival, but in finitude. Just as a sunset is cherished because it ends, just as a flower is precious because it wilts, just as a symphony moves us because it resolves, so too is life made meaningful by its boundaries. Mortality is not only a horizon, it is also a frame, one that makes each moment glow with urgency and worth. So where does this leave us? Not with certainty, not with escape, but with something gentler, with humility before the unknown, with gratitude for the fragile thread of awareness we do have, with a recognition that our moments are precious precisely because they cannot stretch on forever. Perhaps this is the deeper gift of the thought experiment, not the promise of immortality, but the reminder of what really matters: presence. The laughter at a dinner table, the warmth of a hand in yours, the hush of night as you listen to the rain. Each of these is finite, and that is why they are beautiful. And now, as you lie here listening, you might let the night wrap around you like a blanket. The questions can rest. The universe will go on spinning, branches upon branches unfolding. But for you, in this branch, in this moment, it is enough to be here, to breathe, to drift, to let awareness soften into quiet. Thank you for walking with me through this long journey. Thank you for your curiosity, your patience, your willingness to wander among strange and haunting ideas. Whether your eyes are still open or already heavy, whether your thoughts are still spinning or already fading into dreams, know that you are part of a shared story. Fragile, finite, and beautiful. So close your eyes if you haven't already. Let the sound of my voice recede like footsteps down a hallway. Let the night take over, soft and steady. Tomorrow will come, and with it, new questions, new moments, new reasons to wonder. But for now, it is enough to rest. Good night. Sleep peacefully wherever you may be.